Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Chen, and I'm co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and I want to welcome you to our public lecture series on race, religion, democracy, and the American dream. Before introducing our speaker, I want to thank several people whose labor and contributions have made this event possible. First, a big thank you to Kai Nguyen, Patty Dunlop, Hannah Hart, and Simon for doing all the behind-the-scenes work. We wouldn't be here without you. Second, I'd like to thank the Henry Luce Foundation for supporting this lecture series and for the generous co-sponsorship by the Center for Race and Gender, the Center on Race, Sexuality, and Culture, and the Othering and Belonging Institute here at UC Berkeley. And now I'm so delighted to welcome Professor Sahar Aziz as our speaker today. Professor Aziz is Professor of Law, Middle East Legal Studies Scholar, and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Professor Aziz's scholarship examines the intersection of national security, race, religion, and civil rights with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. She is the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School. Professor Aziz is a frequent public speaker and has appeared on outlets such as CNN, BBC, PBS, and MSNBC. She previously served on the board or the ACLU of Texas, and she currently serves on the board of directors of Rethink Media, the Project on Democracy in the Middle East and Democracy in the Arab World Now. Prior to joining legal academia, Professor Aziz served as a senior policy advisor for the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where she worked on law and policy at the intersection of national security and civil liberties. Professor Aziz will be speaking about her groundbreaking new book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sahar Aziz.
Thank you so much for inviting me today to give a talk on my book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. It's always lovely to be back at your beautiful campus, University of California, Berkeley. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Religion. And thank you to Professor Carolyn Chen and to her fabulous team in organizing this event. It's truly an honor to be here. So I will give a formal talk, after which I will answer questions from the audience, both online and in person. The new normal now is these hybrid events. So for those of you who are online, we have people in the room, and I'm delighted to have both the virtual and physical space to be able to present my work. So as we shuffled out of class, the tension in the air was palpable. Instead of the usual sounds of law student chatter, the halls were eerily quiet. I walked toward the lobby, noticing a large congregation of students huddled around the television. I heard gasps at the replays of two commercial airplanes crashing into the World Trade Center. What happened on that Tuesday of my second week of law school is etched in my memory forever. It was the day when I went from being racially ambiguous to racially threatening. As television stations replayed the horrific scenes alongside analysts providing facts piecemeal, a theme was beginning to emerge. This may have been a terrorist attack, not an accident. And the suspected perpetrators were Arab Muslim men. The stares of my classmates felt like lasers. I quickly left the law school as my mind turned to the safety of my mother, who wore the hijab. I feared the backlash would be violent. I worried she would be attacked at the large public hospital where she worked. I also worried about my father, whose first name is Muhammad, and who speaks with a heavy foreign accent. Would their coworkers accost or worse, assault them out of a desire for revenge? Would they be afraid to go to work, to the grocery store, to the mosque? Would we be blamed for these atrocious criminal acts? Our lives in America as invisible minorities were over. We were now racial Muslims. Everything, ranging from our mosques and charities to our travel and clothing, was under scrutiny. American media now associated all things related to Islam with terrorism and threats to national security. Now, fast forward 10 years later. Quote, the New York Police Department gathered intelligence on 250 plus mosque student groups in terrorist hunt, end quote. Read the Associated Press headline on August 24th, 2011. Investigative reporters had uncovered a massive multi-year surveillance program wherein the NYPD, in collaboration with the FBI, was intentionally spying on tens of thousands of Muslims in the tri-state area. So what many of us in the civil rights community had long suspected was now confirmed. Simply being Muslim was sufficient to attract the invasive scrutiny of the state. Now, having advocated for the civil rights of Muslims for nearly a decade, I thought through different legal theories to challenge the NYPD surveillance program. My research led me to Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a law that restricts recipients of federal funding from discriminating in their provision of services. Local and state police departments are among the largest recipients of federal funds from the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. So I thought I was onto something that could avoid the lacuna of the equal protection doctrine that thus far had failed to protect Muslims, much less many other racial minorities, from discrimination. There was one problem though. The text of Title VI. The statute reads, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial aid. Religion is glaringly absent as a protected class under Title VI. Muslims thus are unprotected by the statute. Muslim identity is not a race in any phenotypical sense. Indeed, Muslims are the most diverse faith community in the United States, composed of African Americans, Latinos, and immigrants from more than 75 different countries. Their diversity makes it hard for a lawyer to prove that a particular race or national origin, as required by Title VI, is the grounds for which national security practices are targeting Muslims. And yet, what we are witnessing in the post-9/11 era is a type and degree of profiling and targeting more closely resembling the racial discrimination historically experienced by African Americans, Native American, and Asian American communities of all faiths. Muslims are being treated as a race, and more specifically, a suspect race, rather than a religious minority to be protected from persecution. For that reason, government officials and members of the public who may in fact believe in religious freedom norms do not view targeting Muslims in national security and immigration practices as a threat to religious freedom. And herein lies the genesis of the book. My research led me to more fundamental questions with much broader implications for all Americans. Is our stated commitment to religious freedom meaningful? Does it apply equally to all faiths? If so, then how can we explain the systematic discrimination and subordination of Muslim communities, including physical attacks and surveillance on mosques, their houses of worship, under the guise of national security? The explanation, I believe, lies in the racialization of a minority religious group, a process with a protracted and checkered history in the United States. This book interrogates why and how a country where religious freedom is a founding principle in law and societal norms produces such overt prejudice and discrimination against Muslims. How does the critical mass of Americans in the 21st century that holds unfavorable views of Muslims reconcile their mistreatment of their nations and their own commitments to religious freedom? More pointedly, how do Christian religious conservatives who decry assaults on their own religious freedom justify their support, as shown in numerous polls year after year, for state practices that infringe on Muslims' religious freedoms? I proffer that the explanation lies in how racism intersects with religion to racialize a religion's followers and consequently exclude them from the panoply of religious freedom protections. Put simply, racialization causes a faith community's religious freedoms to be circumscribed or denied altogether. Now, the ways in which particular religious communities are racialized, however, depends on both domestic and international factors that are unique to that group. Thus, my intervention is twofold. First, I argue that the racialization of immigrant Muslims is grounded in a racial religious hierarchy, as opposed to just a racial hierarchy, to socially construct what I call the racial Muslim. Second, I offer a topology of the racial Muslim that explains why some Muslims are more likely to be targeted than others by private and government Islamophobia. So 4 factors converge to racialize Muslims to produce the racial Muslim. First, white Protestant supremacy. Second, xenophobia arising from coercive assimilationism into Western European cultural norms. Third, Orientalism. And fourth, American empire in Muslim majority countries. I explore in my book how each of these factors interact politically, socially, and discursively to define the characteristics attributed to racial Muslims that in turn legitimize their systemic subordination. The co-constitutive nature of religion and race means neither identity exists in isolation, but rather interacts to produce a racial religious hierarchy. Religious identity in certain contexts, thus, functions as a racial marker. That is, the social construction of whiteness is shaped as much by religious identity as it is by skin color, hair texture, facial features, and other phenotypical characteristics. Now, as a critical race theorist, I recognize that race is a social construction, not a biological fact, that has real-life material consequences. Accordingly, I adopt Edward Bonilla Silva's definition of race as, quote, an organizing principle of social relationships that shapes the identity of individual actors at the micro level and shapes all spheres of social life at the macro level. That is, racism arises from racialized social systems in societies where economic, political, and ideological levels are partially structured by the placement of actors in racial categories or races. Now, in applying this structural racism analysis, I adopt Derek Bell's Black-White paradigm and Joe Fagan's white racial frame, which argues that Blacks are permanently at the bottom of the American racial hierarchy and whites are permanently at the top, however Blackness and whiteness is socially constructed. Racial stratification, according to the Black-White paradigm, causes different races to experience positions of subordination and superordination in society and develop different interests accordingly. Now, races at the bottom of the hierarchy are consistently depicted as savage, uncivilized, unfit for self-government. Races at the top, in contrast, are depicted as civilized, liberal, and democratic. The systemic analytical approach differs from the social psychology approach that characterizes racism as an individual phenomena arising from individual prejudice and stereotypes. Now, my theoretical frame takes the systemic racialization theory one step further to argue that the American racial hierarchy is really more accurately described as a religious racial hierarchy. Phenotypical race in American society, to be sure, has been and continues to be a central factor in the placement of people in a racialized social system. However, religion also plays a dispositive role in racialization. This has been true for Blacks, who are racialized as heathen and inferior based on biblical stories, labeling them as the children of Ham cursed into slavery. It was also true for religious minorities such as Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, and for Muslims today, albeit for different reasons and with different material harms. Islamic tenets, regardless of whether practiced or believed in fact, impute to Muslims inherent cultural traits that operate biologically to make them inferior in a white Judeo-Christian supremacist society. So, for example, believing in nonviolent jihads, polygamy, Sharia, hijab, fasting, Ramadan, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is associated with a Muslim's purported innate sense of despotism, savagery, and illiberalism. For both religious conservatives and secular elites in the United States, these religious beliefs and practices cast Muslims as outsiders to American national identity. So more specifically, it casts Muslims as suspected terrorists. Now, racial constraints on religious freedom can be traced to the Puritans' motivations for leaving England. They came to the New World to practice their religion without fear of persecution, from the Anglican Church. They also came to colonize the land pursuant to what they believed was a covenant with God that entails civilizing the purported savage natives. Deploying just divine justifications of conquest, similar to Christopher Columbus's proclaimed God-ordained destiny to discover new lands, the Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They believed they were children of God, with a holy mandate to create a utopian Protestant society. This founding generation believed America was an enchanted land, the city on a hill, where God commanded them to foster and protect Protestantism, which they believed was true Christianity. This white Protestant notion of manifest destiny has since animated America's national identity. Indeed, more than a half century after the United States won its independence from Britain, Herman Melville succinctly articulated what his compatriots have believed since the nation's founding, when he said, quote, "We Americans are peculiar chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. God has predestined, mankind expects great things from our race and great things we feel in our souls," end quote. When the Puritan settlers arrived in America, they found that the native peoples not only looked different, but also practiced unfamiliar religions. Although a diverse group with differing views on the separation of church and state, Puritans and Protestants had no qualms about exploiting, appropriating, and dominating Native Americans, whom they believed were heathens and pagans. Puritans interpreted Native Americans' religions as evil or no religion at all. Either interpretation confirmed their belief that the native peoples were uncivilized savages. Thus, it was the white man's burden to deculturalize and civilize Native Americans. And that occurred through conversion, forced conversion as well. Christians' belief in the inferiority of Africans also mirrored the racialization of Native Americans and was similarly integrated into colonial laws. Likewise, the slave codes passed in the late 17th century emphasized skin color and religion as that which divided the superior from the inferior. White settlers associated enslaved Africans' non-Christian religions with real or imagined inferior racial characteristics. Now, while converting enslaved Africans to Protestantism was deemed necessary to civilize them, their race was considered too indelibly inferior to deserve liberty. Notably, a sizable number of enslaved Africans were Muslims, an estimated 30%, which confirmed colonialist beliefs in their heathenism. However, if an African Muslim slave could read Arabic, he was labeled an Arab or a Moor, inferior to whites, but superior to blacks, because white slave owners deemed Africans incapable of becoming literate. According to this European supremacist logic, Northern Africa belonged to the Asiatic world, which, although inferior to Europe, was superior to Africa in the minds of American slaveholders. Now, although being Christian was not necessary for attaining legal citizenship, being socially raced as white was. So as a result, the millions of European, Jewish, and Catholic immigrants who were white by law, did not receive the social, economic, and political privileges of whiteness. Two waves of mass immigration between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century triggered a white nativist backlash similar to today's xenophobia against Latinos, Muslims, and Asian immigrants. Between 1830 and 1930, approximately 38 million immigrants came to the United States. In 1890, the population was estimated of the United States to be around 70 million. So this is a significant increase in population. Nearly 16 million of these immigrants arrived between 1900 and 1930. For example, in 1920, immigrants and their children made up 76% of New York's population, New York City, 72% of Chicago's population, and 69% of Cleveland's population. And where did this major influx of immigrants come from? Primarily Eastern European Jews, Irish Catholics, and Italian Catholics. By the second decade of the 20th century, Southern and Eastern Europeans were immigrating at twice the number of the so-called English-speaking races. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been established in the 1860s to terrorize newly freed Blacks, reemerged in the 1920s to proclaim Catholics and Jews, in addition to Blacks, as a threat to America. In contrast to the covert Klan of the 1860s and 1870s, the Klan in the early 1900s reemerged in mass public events, recruiting advertisements in newspapers and electing members to political office. With Anglo-Protestant nativism anxiety at fever pitch, the Klan membership peaked in the mid-1920s at an estimated 4 million members in over 43 states. Now, the Klan conflated white nationalism with religion in defense of a Protestant America. Its slogan at the time was, quote, native, white, Protestant supremacy. And they attracted primarily lower and middle class white Protestant men. Similar to German Nazism and Italian fascism, the Klan's white supremacist ideology proclaimed that America must remain Anglo-Saxon and Protestant in accordance with its manifest destiny. The Klan incorporated Protestant churches and evangelicalism into its core mission. Invocation of religious terminology labeling white Protestants as pure and godly, and non-whites and non-Protestants as impure, ungodly, and traitorous, attracted an estimated 40,000 Protestant ministers to join the Klan. Now, the nativists also demanded a curb on immigration, specifically from Eastern and Southern Europe. Similar to President Trump's and his white nativist supporters' contemporary calls to stop so-called chain migration from non-European countries and most explicitly Muslim majority countries through his Muslim ban. Failure to curb immigration would lead to, quote, race suicide of the American old stock, warned the nativists, among them whom were Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Calvin Coolidge. A taxonomy of European races mixed eugenics with biblical reasoning, where a people's geographic origin, skin tone, and religion were attributed to their levels of intelligence, physical health, and moral and political characteristics. So although legally white, for example, Hebrews, Iberians, Levantines, Alpines, and Slavs could be socially white on condition that they assimilate into Northern European Protestant culture. So ultimately, race became a means to rationalize the exclusion of certain groups from obtaining rights, economic opportunity, and legal as well as social equality. Now, in the Dictionary of Races or Peoples, which was produced in the 1911 Dillingham Commission's report on immigration, 45 races were counted entering the United States, of which 36 were indigenous to Europe. The Immigration Restriction League submitted a report to the Dillingham Commission in support of restricting immigration from primarily non-Northwest European, non-Protestant nations because, quote, a considerable proportion of the immigrants now coming are from races and countries which have not progressed, but have been backward, downtrodden, and relatively useless for centuries, end quote. Now, scientific racism's effect on immigration policy culminated in strict national origin quotas in the 1924 Immigration Act, which severely curbed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, which had been subject to the Asian exclusion law since the 1880s, for the next 40 years. So from 1924 until 1965, over 40 years, 70% of immigrants would come from the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Germany, essentially a whitening and a Protestantizing of the American population. So the history of Jewish and Catholic immigrants from Europe brings into sharper relief the role of religion in the racialization process. These communities were legally white, similar to Middle Eastern and North Africans today. However, their religion socially raised them as a threat to the Anglo-Saxon Protestant national identity at the time. Now, although the white nativist ideology that racialized Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the 20th century is deployed against Muslims today, so there's, again, these are undercurrents that continue, racialization of Islam is distinct in various ways. Specifically, European Orientalism and American imperial ambitions in Muslim majority countries placed immigrant Muslims permanently outside the national identity. So, for example, the contemporary portrayal of Islam as a violent political ideology and a false religion is not a new phenomenon. Europe historically situated Islam as the antithesis of modernity and enlightenment, such that a clash with Western Christendom was inevitable. Popular narratives that Islam is malevolent and, quote, spread by the sword were grounded both in European geopolitics and Christian theology. White Protestants believed their race and religion was superior to that of the Mohammedan Turk. American missionaries traveling to the Middle East in the mid-1800s returned with accounts that further racialized Muslims as men of, quote, unrestrained passions full of falsehood and blasphemy, end quote. They believed these Orientals, whether Muslim or Christian, needed to be saved by the West. And remember, many of the Christians in the Middle East were Christian Orthodox or Catholics, so they were subject to being converted to Protestantism. So needing to be saved by the West is a recurring theme of American Orientalism up until the present day. At the turn of the 20th century, European colonies across the world were agitating for independence. The Middle East and North Africa, previously ruled by the Ottomans, was no exception. Among them were Palestinians, governed by the British based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement that drew artificial borders between French and British-controlled territories. But as more Jews were fleeing from pogroms in Eastern Europe to Palestine, and as national origin quotas now excluded people who were from Eastern European Jews from coming to the US, more and more were fleeing to Palestine. And they purchased land using foreign funding as part of a broader European Zionist settler project. The British allowed the mass land purchases initially, notwithstanding the Jewish landowners' refusal to sell land back to Palestinians, which heightened communal conflicts and tensions in Palestine. But consistent with global colonialist policies, pitting Arabs and Jews against each other strengthened British domination over Palestine. However, in 1929 and 1936, in response to Palestinian protests against the Zionist settlers' expanding influence, the British began to restrict Jewish migration and land purchases pursuant to the British White Paper of May 1939. But for the next 2 decades, Jewish leaders in Europe and the United States aggressively lobbied their respective governments to allow more Jews to escape violent anti-Semitism in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, and to immigrate to Palestine for safety. But despite its lofty goal of providing Jews with a permanent homeland, where they would no longer face centuries of European anti-Semitism, Zionism became instrumental in dehumanizing Palestinians in American politics and culture. So at the start of World War II, the American Zionist movement's efforts to establish the state of Israel was gaining momentum. By 1945, magazines and televisions projected into American homes images of Jewish corpses stacked on top of each other and emaciated bodies of the Holocaust survivors. Of the nearly 1 million displaced people, more than 250,000 were stateless Jews seeking to immigrate to Palestine. As Americans realized the gravity of their nation's failure to help Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, in fact, we know that America turned away ships of Holocaust of refugees who ultimately went to their death, right, in the concentration camps. Many Christians in America thus believed it was their moral obligation to support a Jewish homeland. And what better place than the Holy Land? The Holocaust bolstered Zionist claims that only a Jewish state could prevent centuries of European pogroms that culminated in a genocide. Indeed, support for Israel became a unifying force among an increasingly diversifying Jewish population. Now, after 1945, Jewish Americans emerged gradually as a voter base, courted by politicians. By 1948, when the State of Israel was created, what is also known as the Nakba, the disaster for Palestinians, leaders of nearly 5 million second-generation American Jews mobilized to pressure the Truman administration to recognize the State of Israel, and they were successful. So when British officials criticized President Truman for his obvious favoritism toward Israel, he stated, quote, "I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs in my constituents. Meanwhile, the US media portrayed citizens of the newly recognized Jewish state as industrious and brave, often compared to the hardworking Puritans who founded God's American Israel. Israelis would bring civilization and democracy to the backwardness of the Muslim Orient. This comparison of Jews to Puritans fleeing religious persecution in Europe further humanized them to a guilt-ridden American public. The Arab Palestinian, in contrast, were depicted in pictures and texts as irrational barbarians when they defended lands on which they had lived for centuries. Now, at the same time, America's foreign policy priorities shifted dramatically. Specifically, America sought to control the oil reserves in the Middle East and to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding its global influence. The New World Order after World War II prompted academic, policy, and journalistic interest in the so-called Arab people, Islam in the Middle East, and ultimately produced what Edward Said so astutely calls Orientalism. No longer were Muslims a distant threat for European colonialists to manage. They were now America's problem, as it sought to commandeer Muslim-majority lands as client states in the Cold War. The racial Muslim construct was now emerging. But Muslims could still be useful. In 1957, a working group of intelligence and defense officials in the Eisenhower administration published a report that concluded that Islam was more compatible with Christianity as compared to communism, such that it could be deployed to rally support in the Cold War. The CIA agreed that the United States should deploy religion to fight communism by supporting none other than the Muslim Brotherhood and other political Islamists who opposed the secularism of Arab nationalist leaders who were leaning towards the Soviet Union to offset US hegemonic interests. So the Islam strategy, as it was called, would eventually lead to America's financial support of Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. The same ones who later planned the September 11th attacks in New York City. So when it benefited US interests, the United States sent military aid to the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden, calling them freedom fighters against the Soviet Union. But as soon as they were no longer useful to the United States, that is after the fall of the Soviet Union, the same group was designated a terrorist group. Now, after 9/11, all political Islamists would be grouped together in the Muslim terrorist trope, leading to the criminalization of what I call the religious dissident Muslim, the religious dissident racial Muslim and the religious racial Muslim, which I'll go into in a minute. Now, the September 11th attacks finalized a transformation of Muslim identity that had been in the making for decades. The racial markers of Muslim identity now became tied to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, Hamas. Persons who looked, dressed like, or had the same name as terrorists profiled in the media were collectively treated as racial Muslims. Moreover, people of South Asian origin, whether Hindu, Sikh, Christian, or Muslim, joined Arabs in being Muslim-looking. So racial Muslims are not, however, racial Muslims are not treated the same by the government or private actors. And this is where I propose that the performative and social construction of the racial Muslim is hierarchical, not dichotomous. It's not just the good and the bad Muslim. It's more nuanced than that. The severity and extent of state and private acts of racialization vary depending on the racial Muslim's religious practices, political beliefs, and assimilation, as defined by mainstream Anglo-Protestant social norms. So accordingly, the racial Muslim comprises an internal hierarchy that determines which Muslims are most and least likely to be targeted by private and state anti-Muslim racism. The 5 topologies of the racial Muslim are starting from what the government and the public consider the most dangerous to the least dangerous or tolerated. The religious dissident racial Muslim is the most dangerous. The religious racial Muslim is beneath that. The secular dissident Muslim, racial Muslim, and then the secular racial Muslim, which is the best Muslim of all, right? The moderate Muslim, the one who is not religious and who is either apolitical or mainstream. They're the ideal immigrant. And then there's the former Muslim. And the former Muslim tends to be the person, oftentimes women, who converted from Islam to another faith or to atheism, who then go on speaking tours around the country where they're paid and promoted by bona fide Islamophobic organizations to essentially validate that Islam is misogynistic, it's violent, it's savage, they escaped from it, and all of you are correct in thinking that it is a violent, evil political ideology. Now, while skin color, hair texture, facial features, and other phenotypical traits still affect the racialization process, when it comes to the racial Muslim, phenotype is now subsumed by this now racialized Muslim identity. So put another way, a white presenting immigrant or child of an immigrant Muslim named Muhammad cannot escape Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism in the post 9/11 era. He cannot pass, because just by having the name Muhammad or by having a Muslim identity, even if he looks European, makes him racialized as other. The topology partially explains this interplay between the state's prioritization of certain Muslims in national security enforcement on the one hand, and individual identity performances by Muslims seeking to avoid the material and dignitary harms arising from racialization on the other. Secularism and support for American militarism in Muslim majority countries signify higher levels of assimilation into white Christian normalcy. Meanwhile, the secular racial Muslim is the least threatening, both for liberal elites and for religious conservatives. Now, double standards lie at the heart of racialization. Members of the dominant racial religious group are treated and judged by their individual actions, whereas members of the subordinated groups are presumed guilty based on the misdeeds and bad acts of a few individuals who share their religious identities or national origins. This begs the question, why do Christian conservatives who hate Muslims not believe that they are betraying religious freedom principles when they support Muslim travel bans, oppose the construction of mosques, or approve singling out Muslims and countering terrorism? I argue that they reconcile the contradictions by redefining Islam, by placing it outside the purview of religion. To them, Islam is not a religion, but a political ideology. Islam is not holy. It is man-made by savages. Muslims are not a religious minority. They are a suspect race. As a result, defaming, harassing, attacking Muslims is not un-American or antithetical to religious liberty principles. To the contrary, it is as rational as rounding up Japanese Americans after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, when the US government determined they were godless pagans, incapable of being loyal to a liberal democratic America. So both religious conservatives and secular liberals under the leadership of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump adopted national security policies subordinating Muslims, albeit to different degrees. Among the lists are the Muslim ban, torture and indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay, extrajudicial killings using drones, the national security entry-exit special registration program, massive surveillance, targeted use of sting operations against Muslims in anti-terrorism investigations. And I go into those details in the book, and I also have law review articles that provide those facts. The securitization of Muslim identity through state actions that violate Muslim civil liberties and rights are now deemed politically justified by the American public. And private acts of discrimination that otherwise would be viewed as religious bigotry are rationalized as patriotic vigilance or unfortunate consequences of necessary national security policies to keep us safe from them. Now, some Muslims have resisted their racialization by attempting to shift national identity to an Abrahamic one, which was the same strategy used by Jews and Catholics before World War II to make America not a Protestant nation, but a Judeo-Christian nation, so that the social construction of whiteness would expand to include Jews and Catholics. My theoretical frame, however, begs the question, what is the future of the racial Muslim? Is it a permanent fixture in American race politics, or a temporal construction that will dissipate over time? Will Muslims call for that new Abrahamic national identity be successful? in replacing the current Judeo-Christian identity. And that could bring some Muslims who phenotypically are white presenting, whatever that social construction is, into the fold of national identity and by extension first-class citizenship? Or will Muslim identity become deracialized insofar as any individual's phenotypical traits now determine how they are socially raised, white, brown, Asian, Black? Or will Muslim identity be a racial marker that permanently bars immigrant Muslims alongside African-American Muslims who collectively experience second-class citizenship on account of their Blackness? These questions animate the final chapter of the book. As I examine the responses of racial Muslims ranging from neoliberal multicultural interfaith initiatives to progressive cross-racial coalitions confronting systemic racism. Although calls for a new Abrahamic American national identity may decrease discrimination against some immigrant Muslims, they will only create a new exclusionary racial boundary that will harm followers of non-monotheistic faiths and continue to racialize African-American Muslims. Anticipating this peril, a growing number of young American Muslims have joined cross-racial solidarity movements seeking to eliminate America's racial religious hierarchy altogether and the privileging of whiteness. They recognize that replacing Judeo-Christian identity with Abrahamic identity merely continues systemic racialization of religion. Now, to be sure, no single book can adequately theorize the experiences of state and private discrimination against such diverse communities. We have 30% are African Americans, 30% are from the Middle East and North Africa, 30% are from Asia, 5% are Latinx, and they're the fastest growing Muslim community in America through conversion, and then 5% are multiracial or identify as multiracial. Now, as a result, the most glaring limitation of my book is my purposeful focus on immigrants and children of immigrant Muslims who arrived after 1965. Although I take into account how the racialization of African-American Muslims has shaped the racialization of immigrant Muslims, I agree with Sylvia Chan-Malek and Zain Abdullah that the racialization of African-American Muslims is intertwined with the enslavement of Africans, of whom approximately 30% were Muslim. I also concur with Edward Curtis IV in his assessment that African-American Muslims are racialized as Black first, resulting in their Black identity intersecting with their Muslim identity to create experiences of private and state discrimination uniquely different from those of immigrant and children of immigrant Muslims, although overlapping in some ways, which I do address in the book. While both immigrant and African-American Muslims suffer subordination arising from white Christian dominance, different factors shape their racialization and consequent forms of subordination. Specifically, the root cause of discrimination against African-American Muslims lies largely in the legacies of slavery that produced Jim Crow segregation, lynching, mass incarceration, school-to-jail pipelines, and the extreme poverty of Black inner-city ghettos. In contrast, discrimination against immigrant Muslims and their children is animated largely by Orientalism, American Empire and Muslim majority countries, xenophobia, and theologically based Islamophobia. Now, whatever the future of the racial Muslim may hold, this book demonstrates that being Muslim currently circumscribes access to the privileges of first-class citizenship, including the full panoply of religious freedom rights. Their experiences evince what African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans and Latinx Americans already know. Religion is not, or has it ever been, equally available to all faith communities in the United States. Irrespective of the future of American race politics and Muslims' place in it, this book is my humble attempt to equip scholars, advocates, and policymakers with a deeper understanding of why a religious minority faces such blatant discrimination in a nation that prides itself on and legally privileges religious freedom. When we acknowledge the disconnect between our ideals and our practices, only then can we fulfill our aspirations for a pluralistic and more inclusive American society. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer questions online or in person. And I will allow Professor Chen to moderate. Thank you, everyone that's online for attending and staying with me. And I look forward to engaging with you all.
question first from online. This is from Joshua Garcia. Thank you for the thoroughly illuminating lecture. Could you please speak about your idea of the stratification of the dangerousness of racial Muslims, specifically those who are deemed the least dangerous, and how that plays into immigrant generations growing up in an increasingly secularizing United States?
Great question. Okay, so the most dangerous is and most dangerous as perceived by the state. And then remember, the members of the public take their cues from the state. So we can't underestimate the legitimizing factor of state action vis-a-vis Muslims, vis-a-vis African Americans, any group of people. But when the state says it's justified to surveil these communities, right? It's justified to deport them and have an executive order keeping millions of them from coming, many Americans will say, oh, okay, then that means they're bad people. Right? We don't take for granted, for those of us who may be in the room, who may be who are critical of state policies because we're trained to question state practices. That's not the majority response, because most people believe that state action is legitimate. And so if you are religious and a dissident, what I mean by dissident is, it's obviously relative, but specifically the type of dissidence that is seen to be the most dangerous for people who have a Muslim identity is when you are opposed to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, or you are opposed to imperialistic ambitions, US's imperialistic ambitions in Muslim majority countries, right? Because then you have this questionable loyalty. Who's your loyalty to? You're opposing our policies in your country of origin, as if you were part of the coercive assimilationist project, which affects all immigrants, is that by coming here, you have to be blindly loyal to state practices. You don't get the right to question the state, because that's the condition on which we accept you. Whereas if you're a member of the white majority, well, that's considered very patriotic and American. Right? And that's why immigrants are constantly trying to prove their loyalty. And the way they prove their loyalty, there's many ways, but one of them is, I have a flag, I support the government, I support the US. And they don't have that freedom, because if they exercise that First Amendment right, in terms of political dissidence, then their loyalty starts to get questioned. And that applies to people who are Muslim, who are, again, this is why I'm focusing on immigrant children and now grandchildren of post-65 immigrants. But if you're religious and not a dissident, then you're still suspicious, because your religiosity makes you, its perception is, well, you could be recruited by a terrorist group. Right? You might join ISIS, you might join Al-Qaeda because you're religious. And part of the racialization or the racial stereotypes is that Al-Qaeda represents Muslims, that ISIS represents Muslims, right? That Osama bin Laden is the leader of the Muslim world, which is completely false. It's like saying the Ku Klux Klan represents all white people. It doesn't, right? And so that religiosity makes you suspicious, but less suspicious than being a dissident. Now, I had kind of said this in the talk, but the ideal Muslim is similar to the ideal immigrant, fully assimilated into Northern European Protestant norms in terms of how you dress, how you talk, how you live, who you marry, who you befriend, and also being politically compliant. Right? So either stay out of politics altogether and be grateful that you're in America, or if you are going to get involved, rah for the mainstream Democrat or mainstream Republican. But once you go into dissident mode and you're critical, whether it's on the left, and I would say even arguably on the right, but more on the left is what I've noticed, then suddenly, again, you're not being a good immigrant. And the fact that you have a Muslim identity, even though it's highly secularized, makes you like, we don't know, are you going to turn on us? It just triggers suspicion. But my racial Muslim construct is intentionally not about what the person, how religious the person is in fact. I mean, part of being racialized is that things are being imputed upon you, right? And so yes, if you are in fact religious, that leads to more suspicion. But if you're not religious, which again, it's up to you, it doesn't matter. And that's kind of part of my argument is when you're racialized, just like if you, I kind of use the analogy of skin color, because that's the way we've always, we understand race as skin color, right? But I'm arguing, well, it's not just skin color. And when someone has a dark skin color, whatever that means, that's not considered white, it doesn't matter who they are as a person. It doesn't matter what they believe. It doesn't matter how anything. They're now raced. So now all of the negative stereotypes are imputed upon you that are associated with that race, that is associated with that skin color. Now you may individually in your small circle, through your behavior, through trying to prove yourself that you're not that negative stereotype, be able to escape that. But that in no way changes the racialization, because racialization is very group-based, right? So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
So the question is actually completely related to the previous one, and just a kind of footnote question to that. Did I understand you correctly that in your typology, after, so the most dangerous will be religious dissident, but then I'm interested in the second and the third placement, religious and only after religious dissident, i.e. like a religious Muslim would be considered more of a threat than explicitly dissident,
Yes.
but secular
Yes.
person.
Yeah.
So could you say more about
Yeah.
that? That seems pretty.
Yeah, so a secular dissident is less threatening than a religious non-dissident, because being religious is perceived in itself as a political statement, right? Because it's a form of, the perception is you're not assimilating. Because I mean, when I mean religious, I mean you wear the hijab, you attend the mosque, you fast, you want religious accommodation in work, you want religious accommodation in school. Your life is structured around your religion, and that affects everything about your life. You don't drink alcohol. So that already kind of signifies that you're not a good immigrant. You're not playing by the rules, by the conditional acceptance, right? As opposed to, oh, well, you're Muslim, but that's okay, because we're a pluralistic society. But you could just be Muslim by name, right? And because the racialization of Muslim is so deeply tied to Islam, right? That by being religious, now we don't know, are you going to you read the Quran a lot, so you must believe in jihad. So does that mean that you're a stealth Muslim? Are you a secret cell? Are you someone who is a Trojan horse? Remember all the conspiracy theories, and I document this in the book, that were somewhat associated with Barack Obama, which was anti-Black racism veiled through Islamophobia, thinly veiled as Islam. It was Islamophobia thinly veiled as anti-Black racism. But you have to be, by being religious, you're then you're suspected of being politically associated with these terrorist groups. Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. It's completely false, but that's how those groups are portrayed, right? When you're a secular dissident, I mean, when I mean by secular dissident, I mean people who, it's very obvious that, they drink, they engage in premarital sex, which is forbidden, in Islam. They're just totally secularized. They're Muslim by name only, and it's kind of like cultural Muslim. But as far as their lifestyle is concerned, they're very Americanized. However, and that then decreases, that's like they're assimilated, right? So that's less threatening that, well, ISIS isn't going to recruit that one, right? And Al-Qaeda is not going to recruit that one because they don't follow the rules. So we don't have to worry about them in that regard. However, they oppose U.S. policy on Israel. They support Palestinian human rights. They oppose America's support of Saudi Arabian authoritarianism. They support systemic anti-Black racism efforts, right? They're critical of American policy. They're claiming that America is a settler colonial state, that America is, systemically racist against Blacks. That's not a good American. That's not a good immigrant, right? Now you're a dissident. And because you're not white, you're not a member of the majority group, you don't get that right to do that. Right? That's part of how racism works. That's what I mean by the double standards. So you're still considered, that's how you get racialized. But this is my position. People can disagree. What I hope the book will do is create disagreement and generate debate and generate questioning, kind of my theoretical frame. But I believe, based on my interpretation of kind of the facts over the last 20 years, is I think they're perceived as less dangerous, and they're the ones that are going to be surveilled less. So it's like, where do the state's resources go, right? And remember, the secular dissidents are not trying to build mosques, which is what the religious racial Muslims are doing, and the religious dissident Muslims are doing. And building mosques is considered a threat, and that's where you get the private actors. There's an entire docket of cases where Americans are opposing the construction of mosques in their neighborhood. And they are explicitly stating this is a national security threat. These people are terrorists, and they're going to have a mosque, and it's going to produce terrorists. And they have gone on the record in court cases, including in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where the Department of Justice had to intervene in the case to write a brief that simply said Islam is a religion, because I'm trying to think if they were the plaintiffs or the defendants, but because the plaintiffs were arguing this mosque is not protected by the Religious Land Use and Inmate Protection Act because Islam is not a religion. They put that in a legal brief. That's how bad it is. It's laughable, but it's sad, right? So that's why I think that it makes a difference. But what we're seeing now, and I can tell you this, because this is actually becoming, especially with the secular dissident, is and also with the religious dissident, but let's just stick to the secular dissident, because this is happening a lot on college campuses and among college kids who, because they're second, third generation now, first, second generation Americans, second, third generation children of immigrants, they tend to be more secularized, not necessarily, but you're seeing more of that, which is typical of the immigrant experience in America. If you're of Muslim identity and you criticize American foreign policy in Israel, you are first, you're accused of being anti-Semitic, which is an Islamophobic trope, because one of the stereotypes of Muslims is that they hate Jews, and that's false. Right? One of the stereotypes of Arabs is that they hate Jews, that we have some kind of genetic hatred of Jews, which is absolutely false. Like the pogroms, the Holocaust, all of the centuries of anti-Semitism that was violent happened in Europe. Right? Some of the greatest Jewish philosophers and intellectuals were from North Africa, right? They lived there for centuries. So there's a whole misinformation campaign that is all structured around the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? And trying to dehumanize Palestinians, which then, pre 9/11, it was the Palestinian terrorist trope, and then post 9/11, it's the Muslim trope, which is completely disconnected from history. So being a secular dissident Muslim is part of that, is that Islamophobic trope that you're anti-Semitic if you defend Palestinian human rights.
Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
Thank you. So I really appreciate your talk. And I really appreciate the ways that in which you're showing how religion animates racial thought. And particularly connecting that phenomenon in terms of how it occurs with regards to Muslim Americans, and putting the context of how that has happened to other Americans across time. I think it's a really important move and really illuminating. And the question I have for you is, I think your work is an extension of many other people who have demonstrated the ways in which kind of religion has been a constitutive aspect of racial thought. And I'm always just blown away by how difficult it is for many Americans to understand how so much of their racial thinking is kind of comes from religious framework. And there has been this inability to understand it. In fact, I think many Americans assume that religious thinking is an antidote to racial thought.
Yes.
When in reality, it's been a foundation to it. So
Yes.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on how that occurs. Is this just a slippage that's happened over time, or is this part of an active campaign to kind of frame religion as something that is interior to racial thought, as a way to kind of keep that relationship both hidden and pervasive? If that makes any sense.
It's a great question. So I think, at least based on the research for this book, which was somewhat, limited in scope in terms of the role of religion, is that religion is, it was too articulate. The role of it's really the role of religion. The question is, what's the role of religion in terms of justifying racism or legitimizing racism, as opposed to simply being an antidote to racism? Is that correct?
Why is it so many people have such a hard time understanding what is a very obvious connection between religion and racism?
Right.
And I think another example of this, for example, if I can go for a couple of seconds, for example, you can think of like the January 6th siege.
Yes.
And I think many people see that as the people with the most clarity seem to see that as an iteration of white nationalism. But there's another layer to that in terms of the way that kind of religiosity frames the nationalism that led people to engage that type of behavior. But we haven't really had a conversation about the religiosity and the furor and some of the imagery that occurred on January 6th.
Yes.
That constituted that very kind of action. We kind of see it as kind of blatant racial animus, but we don't see it as how that's driven by a certain sense of kind of whiteness that is deeply constituted by a religious sensibility. And we need to talk about that because that framework is really doing a lot of work that, by not discussing it, allows it to kind of further vest within society.
Okay. So I'll just read. So the question is, why Americans have such a hard time seeing the connection between religion and racism, and, for example, January 6th, how what many Americans will accept as blanket racial animus, but do not realize or appreciate that it's animated by religious sensibilities, especially Christian religious sensibilities. I don't know. Okay, so the first half of my book is essentially trying to make that case, again, focusing on setting it up for racialization of Muslims, but effectively showing how religion has always been in the mix, if not at the I didn't say it's at the forefront, but I did show how religion, especially with Jews and Catholics, I kind of use that as the case studies of how, because to me, that was the most paradigmatic example where you could exclude all the other variables. In other words, you could say, well, they're white by law, they're from Europe. And so the primary difference was their religion. And so that kind of helps you to go, this makes it more clear that it's religion. And then you look at the way in which they were mistreated and discriminated against. Now, clearly not nearly as severely as Blacks or Asians or Native Americans, but certainly enough to bring that to the forefront. And I also talk in the book about the connection between Christianity and the Ku Klux Klan, which no one talks about, right? I think it's convenient. It's very difficult for a nation, and I would, I'm going to try to be objective and say, if we were in a Muslim majority country, we'd probably have the same cognitive dissonance. But I think it's very difficult for a country that identifies as a Christian nation to recognize that its own religion is perpetuating oppression And if it does, it's then, well, that's a misinterpretation of the faith, right? That's an abuse of the faith. That's not the true faith. That's not the right interpretation. So I would expect that from any religious group as a kind of form of self-preservation and not wanting to accept that your own religion is doing bad. But I agree with you. I mean, again, it's why I wrote this book, because I found this gap. And I thought, why isn't anyone talking about religion and in this racialization process? And Muslims kind of bring it to the forefront because we are discriminated because of our religion. Right? But the problem is everyone's like, well, that's religious bigotry. It's like, no, it's racism. And actually, if you go and look at history, religion has always played a role. Now, people will recognize that, for example, you know, in abolition movements, there were people who were pro-abolition because of their faith. But then there were the people on the other side that said, God made us that way. God made them inferior. God made us superior. God said that they're supposed to be our slaves, and they would interpret that. But again, it's not, we don't want to put that in school books as front and center, because that would cause criticism of the majority religion. So I mean, I don't have an answer for you other than to say that, yes, I agree with you. And I think it needs to be spoken about more, but I think politically it's very difficult when that's the majority religion. And you also have to be careful about doing it in a way that doesn't kind of create the reversal where you blanket all Christians, right? I mean, it has to be done with nuance so that we don't, it's not so much about what Christianity is, but more of how Christianity has been deployed, or religion has been deployed to perpetuate racism. And then the question is, so what? I mean, who is supposed to, what do we want? Do we want the Christian communities to address that as an internal problem? Do we want to bring that more into the history books to make people understand? And then you get into the culture wars between secularism and religiosity, and then the people who are identified as religions feel that they're under assault. So I think politically it's also really challenging, but I think intellectually and academically I think it's obvious to me. I mean, I think the history is pretty clear. It's just a matter of how you narrate history and how and what, and making sure that you bring forward those facts. So, but I guess one other point I would point, and I'm interested to see what you think is, I mean, as you know, Christianity was also used as a liberation theology, right, by MLK and by many Black leaders, not just during the civil rights movement. And so this is where you kind of get into that space of like, well, what is religion? And is it just simply a vehicle and a tool? And then that can be used for various things. You know, how absolute is it? And how much of it is the religion itself versus the people who have their own motivations who then use it as a tool. But one thing that I find really frustrating as a Muslim is that no one seems to have a problem in this country of criticizing and pointing out how Islam can be abused by extremists to justify oppression. Of course it can, and it has. But nobody wants to do that about Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism. I mean, you have a Hindutva movement right now that is a Hindu supremacy movement that is openly discriminating and oppressing Muslims. And so I think that's where we need to really, at least politically, we need to bring that conversation to go, wait a minute, there's no religion that's immune. And if you're going to talk about American racism, then you have to talk about the American religion of Christianity. And then recognize that this is one of the multiple ideologies that contribute and feed into racism. So you should write an op-ed.